I thought there would be investigations after the 2000 election and that the crimes that were committed would be prosecuted or at least made known. And what happened instead was people were told, just move on, get over it. You know, there was an investigation, but it was set up so that it said the inquiry was about the technology, and it wasn't about the partisanship in the election administration. Have you seen this movie, Recount? It goes over, well, they're actual crimes that are displayed in the movie, but you don't know they're crimes unless you know the law. On the morning after the election, after Election Day, the general counsel, the lawyer in Governor Jeb Bush's office, called the 5 largest law firms in Florida and told them that the governor didn't want them working for Al Gore. And they didn't work for him. He had to hire an attorney from out of state. They got boys. And this is reported in the movie. It's just kind of a matter-of-fact thing. But the reality was that that was a felony. That was use of public office for coercion. They were threatening these law firms with loss of business if they took on Gore's case. Well, there were many crimes like that committed during the 2000 election, and nothing was done. And even the movie Recount, you know, it shows James Baker. He comes across as this real tough guy who's, you know, really competent. And Warren Christopher, the leader of Gore's campaign, comes across as this wimp who gets, you know, pushed around by Baker. The reality was Warren Christopher was following the law. He was doing what the law said. He wanted to do the right thing, and Baker was abusing the law. So it was very frustrating seeing this. And I wrote a book about the 2000 election and specified the crimes that were committed. It was published by the University Press of Florida. Academic book, got relatively little attention, but it laid the facts are there. But when I saw that nothing was going to happen about it, I started studying this topic, and I came up with this term, state crimes against democracy. I have a definition for it: concerted actions or inactions by government insiders intended to manipulate democratic processes and undermine popular sovereignty. It's a terribly turgid definition. The way I developed it was I did a list of what these suspicious events are. There's some that we know, there's no dispute about the Watergate break-in, the crimes of Watergate, the Iran-Contra scandal, the outing of Valerie Plame, the lying us into war in Iraq. This is all documented. So we know that there are these high crimes to subvert democratic processes. But I did a list that included others that we suspect that. The Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, George Wallace, the attempt on his life, the attempt on Ronald Reagan's life, the 1968 October surprise. I'll tell you about what these are, but anyway, it was a long list. It was like 20-something events, about a third of which were well confirmed and others we were suspicious about. And I extrapolated from that list to come up with this definition. The basic idea was to have a name for the type of crime that the term conspiracy theory discourages us from speaking about. If we can't name the crime, it's very hard to discuss it. And I was thinking about it like white-collar crime or juvenile crime. We needed a name for this kind of crime that we could then study and get, you know, basic ideas about the profile, who commits these crimes, what are the institutional vulnerabilities. I say actions or inactions. When there's a stand down like there was on 9/11 appears to be, where people don't defend the country, that's a SCAD. That's a crime in itself. It's a treason, a form of treason. The Vietnam War was started on a false pretense. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed. We had our gunships off the islands of North Vietnam, and we were firing on these islands, large cannon fire. And then when the North Vietnamese would come out, we would race back to international waters. And our ships reported they were attacked in the summer of 1964, and they said that they were doing nothing. They were in international waters minding their own business. And so the administration lied to Congress and got that war started when it was really a provocation or a kind of an inaction. I use government insiders because it isn't always the case that it's somebody in government. It can be a political insider. I'm thinking about Nixon. Nixon in 1968 was running for president, and there were peace talks going on between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States. And Nixon thought if they made peace, that he would not win the election, that Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, would win the election. And so he sent word to North Vietnam, to their president, saying, withdraw from the peace talks, and I'll get you a better deal. That's a treason. I mean, what the man did was treason. The reason we know about this is because Lyndon Johnson, we have a taped telephone call between Lyndon Johnson and Everett Dirksen, a U.S. Senator, Republican leader at the time. And Lyndon Johnson knew that Nixon had done this because he had wiretapped Nixon's plane, his campaign plane. Yeah, I mean, these guys, they do all this stuff. Mission Impossible, this is what these people do. This came out in 1997, and Johnson is talking to Dirksen. He says, I can't believe he's done this. He sabotaged the peace talks. This is treason, but I'm not going to tell the American people because it would destroy their faith in their leaders and their country. So we learned about this in 1997. It's in the news one day. And these events, many of them, they eventually become known, and we understand the dynamics of them and who was involved. But it's often long after the event. It receives very little attention, and there's no effort to go back and rewrite history with the awareness of this. But anyway, the point was Nixon was not in office, but he was a political insider, and he was doing this as an anti-democratic high crime. I've written a number of articles about this. I won't belabor this much, but I wanted you to know I first wrote about it and defined the state crimes against democracy concept or construct in 2006. And I started working with this guy, Matthew T. Witt. He's a professor at Laverne University in California. And I have to tell you, when you accept that John Kennedy was assassinated by the government, and the evidence is very strong for that. At the very least, the government covered up that it was a conspiracy. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And once you come to understand that, you should rethink how you think about American government. From then on, you should say, well, these guys are capable of some pretty outlandish things. But my tendency was I would admit this about Kennedy. I would admit Watergate. Everybody knows Watergate. I think we tend to minimize it. Watergate is called the Watergate burglary. It was actually a wiretapping. And the people who were arrested were going back into the National Democratic Party headquarters. They had wiretapped it 3 weeks prior, and they had transcripts and they were reading them. But one of the wiretaps went out, so they were going back into the National Democratic Party headquarters to replace that wiretap, and they got arrested. The two principals, Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, worked for the White House and were consultants for the committee to re-elect the president. They had planned to kill Jack Anderson, an investigative reporter, and Teddy Kennedy, and they had monitored Teddy Kennedy's activities. But the plan was called off. There are many other things. When the Watergate, when the guys were arrested, Howard Hunt sent his wife, Dorothy Hunt, to the White House to tell the White House, look, all of these people that have been arrested in Watergate have obligations. We have mortgages to pay. We have kids in college. We expect our expenses to be covered. They said if you're in the CIA and you're arrested overseas, they take care of your family. And they felt like they were working for the president. They thought it was a legitimate operation, and they should be covered. Nixon referred to it as hush money. He understood it was blackmail. John Dean speaks about Dorothy Hunt and says that she was just a completely savvy person, that she was wife of a CIA agent and had gone all over the world. And she had been a CIA agent in France before she married Howard Hunt. Well, Dorothy gets several $100,000 for the Watergate burglars, as they call it. They call the Watergate burglars because the day after it happened, the press secretary of the President Nixon said, "This is a third-rate burglary attempt. We had nothing to do with it. It's just a screw-up by these overzealous campaigners." And we call it a burglary to this day when it was espionage at the highest level, attacking the opposition Democratic Party during a presidential election. What I wanted to tell you about Dorothy Hunt, though, was she was on a plane flight to Chicago with $10,000 in cash to disperse, and her plane crashed, and she was killed. There was a grand jury impaneled in Chicago, and they brought Robert Haldeman in to testify because they thought it had been that he had killed her, that the Nixon people had killed her. There was no evidence, and all they did was make him testify, and then they let him go. We know this in part because Haldeman tells this to Nixon in the White House, and we have it on the White House tapes. But the point is, Watergate was more than a burglary. I mean, we're talking about a crime spree of fairly wide proportions. The break-in to Howard Hunt's psychiatrist office, Ellsberg's psychiatrist office, there were 100 break-ins like that around Washington at that time, where the people's psychiatrists had their files rifled when they were providing psychoanalytic services to very important people's wives or husbands. So Watergate was, this massive crime spree. Witt got me thinking about it in those terms. He would say, I would say, well, Nixon was crazy. I thought of Nixon as I think most of us do think about him as, he was paranoid and nuts and a gangster. It took me a while to get used to the idea that a lot of them are like that. It's not just him, So he helped me with that. We wrote an article in 2010 that was published in the American Behavioral Scientist, which is a fairly widely read journal. And there was an op-ed that was written by Mickey Huff, some guys at Project Censored. They said that they wrote about this study and they submitted it to an online website that they had published other things in, and they were told they would not publish this because it was on conspiracy theory. And they were stunned. I mean, they said, this is what we do. We publicize things that are being stifled, and we had this outlet, and they told us that we couldn't publish on that. But I don't think many people would have read it if these guys hadn't publicized it. I wrote an article on the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and this was kind of shocking to me to go back and read about this. I was teaching a class on international conflict and international law, and so I read the Constitution, I read the UN Charter, and I read the War Powers Resolution of 1973 and the 2001 authorization to use military force against the people who planned 9/11 and the 2002. And what I found was we break the law all the time, okay? I mean, when we threaten Syria, that's a violation of the UN Charter. We are signatories to the UN Charter. Our Constitution says our treaties are the highest law of the land. They're higher than the law. They're higher than the Constitution. And that treaty says we're not going to invade people unless we're being attacked. And we have to get a resolution from the United Nations to continue, even if we're attacked. We have to get their support to continue it. But we violate it all the time. Well, I went back, I said, let's look at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. And to my surprise, what I found was that the first charge in the indictment of the Nazi war criminals was a conspiracy charge. They had conspired to overthrow the parliamentary government in Germany and then warmonger and strike fear into people's hearts and then start an aggressive war against other countries. Do you know what we did to these people? We hung them. We hung them. They included not only politicians, they included diplomats who were fronting for the Nazi war of aggression. They included journalists who were warmongers and anti-Semites. They included lawyers. We prosecuted these criminal cases because after the war, Stalin said, let's kill all the officers in the Nazi army. And Churchill said, no, we can't do that. Let's kill 20,000 of them. And it was kind of glib, but that's really what they said. And the Americans said, no, we have to teach a lesson to the German people. We have to show them what their leaders did, and we have to show them that they have a responsibility as citizens in an elected representative democracy to not let power be consolidated and to never let this happen again. The Germans have learned that lesson pretty well. I mean, they're very cautious about what they do in foreign policy. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, and sorry to interrupt you.
It's all right.
My name is Kathleen, and I think that Nazi Germany never really ended. Just a show was put on, and they've been transferred here.
Well, there's an operation called Paperclip where we brought in their intelligence apparatus, basically wholesale, into the United States. And what I did in this article was simply compare what the Bush-Cheney administration did in terms of twisting the intelligence and telling people that we were going to be potentially, that this country was trying to build nuclear bombs and had weapons of mass destruction and they could give them to terrorists and we were in peril, when they knew otherwise. They knew otherwise. The torture that we talk about, the torture occurred in August of 2002 at Guantanamo Bay. There were 2 people tortured, and they were waterboarded like 186 times. I mean, it was a horrendous thing. But what they were doing was trying to get confessions linking 9/11 to the country of Iraq. And once they couldn't get that, they stopped it. There was Abu Ghraib and all that. That was different. This was torture that came right out of the White House. So anyway, I did this article and said, if you look at what the Bush-Cheney administration did and you compare it to our charges against the Nazis at Nuremberg, you'll find they're parallel, almost exactly, bang, bang, bang. I could not get that published in the United States. I had it reviewed at one journal 3 times, and the reviewers kept saying, this is a great article. This is an important article. We cannot publish it. Literally, I'd never seen anything like this. I submitted it to Contemporary Politics, was the name of the journal, and they published it right away. It's published in London. It's a British journal, and it taught me a lesson about what we're up against. Science is supposed to be a search for the truth. It's not an organ of legitimation for the power structure in America, but that's pretty much what it appears to be, because it was too controversial. I knew the editor. He was a good friend of mine. He kept trying. He wanted to publish it. And he would send it to 3 reviewers every time, and we would get these split decisions with a very strong, we can't publish it. I had submitted another article, the one that got published in the American Behavioral Scientist, I submitted to Public Administration Review, the major journal for the American Society of Public Administration. It was reviewed, and 2 reviewers said we should publish it, and 1 reviewer said don't. That's a split decision. And the typical thing is they have you make revisions and then publish it. Well, I made the revisions, resubmitted it, and the editor writes me back and says, we had one of the reviewers who had said publish, change his mind, and he said don't publish it. He said it was too good for their journal. Honest to God, he said it's too good for our journal. I went to the editorial board meeting that year, and it was in Miami, and complained about it. And this was the only time this had ever happened in the history of the journal. And the editor apologized to me at the meeting. He said, but that's the way it goes. I mean, we're not going to overrule the reviewers. Well, and what I assumed, being a conspiracy theorist, that there had been a conspiracy to keep this from being published. But I've had some interesting experiences with all this. But the reason I tell you about it is you're probably not aware of the academic background on it. And there's a pretty good body of research now that establishes that there are these kinds of crimes. They need to be looked at comparatively and collectively together so you see patterns in them. And that you can't depend on the government there are a number of reasons I'll go over why we can't depend on the government to give us the truth. There's a book from Paul Gray Macmillan on state crimes against democracy. That's the title of the book. So the term's getting out. That just came out about 3 months ago. And then this book I wrote because a friend of mine, Mark Crispin Miller at New York University, asked me to write it. I'd written a chapter on the 2000 election for a book of his, and it was like 2006, and he said, you ought to write a book on this. And so I really appreciate his help in helping me frame it. I won't belabor this, but I just want to point out that SCAD is not a conspiracy theory. It's not a term for that. It's a term for the crime. We wouldn't say white-collar conspiracy, or white-collar theory. We would say white-collar crime. And it's the same way with state crimes. You have to think in terms of crimes, not theories of crimes. I think y'all know that it's a pejorative term. The problems with the term conspiracy theory, it's a totally nonsensical term. The way it's used is anything that is suspicious of government insiders conspiring to subvert democratic processes is considered ludicrous, paranoid. Well, it's nonsensical because we know conspiracies happen. We had Watergate, we had Iran-Contra, we had Planegate. We know conspiracies happen. So it's crazy to say any suspicion of conspiracy is got to be ludicrous. It's quite the opposite. You should be carefully discerning what are reasonable suspicions and what are not. The conspiracy theory label lumps everything together, from aliens taking over the planet to who assassinated Kennedy. And you lump them all together and then take the most ludicrous example and equate all other suspicions with that. That's not reasonable. That's unreasonable. Conspiracy theory label is un-American. The Declaration of Independence is a conspiracy theory. I urge you to read it. The first part of the Declaration is about inalienable rights, but then it goes on to list a set of crimes that King George committed or was suspected of committing that were intended together to deprive the colonists of their rights as British citizens. And they said they suspected that the king was trying to gain tyranny over them and that gave them the right. Not any of the crimes individually, but what they suspected about his motives. So people who say conspiracy theory is ludicrous forget that America was founded on a conspiracy theory. I've already mentioned the Nuremberg war crimes trials. That's Robert Jackson, who was a Supreme Court justice who was our prosecutor in Nuremberg. When people use the term conspiracy theory, what they're forcing on you, in addition to shutting you up and saying that you're crazy, what they're suggesting is that the official account of these events is solid, strong evidence, and what you've got is speculation and, at the very least, dubious. But in reality, if you look at the official accounts of things like the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, basically they are coincidence theories. They're troubling patterns that on their face look suspicious, and they're dismissed as coincidences. When you talk about 9/11 to somebody, or the anthrax letter attacks, or the Kennedy assassination, they will tell you that the American government would not commit crimes like this. And furthermore, if they did commit them, they're not competent enough to do it. They couldn't pull it off. And furthermore, if by some fluke they did succeed in doing one of these things, they couldn't keep it quiet. Somebody would talk. So there's this assumption that you couldn't do these things. They're just on its face. I have Daniel Ellsberg's book, Secrets, the cover up there. It's a great book. What he reminds us of is that the Manhattan Project, which involved 100,000 people developing the atomic bomb, was kept secret throughout World War II. Totally secret. Truman, when he became president after FDR died, he did not know about the atomic bomb for a week until they told him. It's kept secret through compartmentalization, the need to know. People are working on it, but they don't know what it is. They're doing this part, they're doing that part, building the casing, So it's quite easy for the government to keep secrets. It does an excellent job of it. It's got a very sophisticated technique for doing it. Ellsberg also points out that people who are privy to these secrets think they are really special, think that they really know what's up. So they don't want to tell anybody. What they do is remain silent. He says they listen to people and they think in their minds, if this person knew what I knew, they wouldn't be saying what they're saying. They consider everybody else really just foolish and out of the loop. And the last problem with the conspiracy theory label is that people who use it attack individuals. They attack individuals who say that John Kennedy was killed by more than one shooter, or 9/11 was a controlled demolition of the buildings. They attack individuals, but they never talk about the conspiracy theories of the institutions, of the government itself. The conspiracy theory of Iraq trying to get nuclear weapons. Now, that was a dangerous conspiracy theory. That was a conspiracy theory that cost 100,000 lives and thousands of our soldiers. That was a dangerous conspiracy. Does anybody say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, you shouldn't say that? No, no. So it's really a terrible term. Yes, sir.
One other thing I'd just throw on the false
Please.
premise. There's a very important false premise that we have like a free press in this country that's aggressive and that just can't wait to expose these kind of things. And if you just go to them and show them the evidence, they'll run right over to the cameras and...
You're absolutely correct. There's an article by Sunstein, the guy who wrote about what is it? Cass Sunstein. His wife is Samantha Power, the new UN person. Oh, God. He said exactly what you said. He said the newspapers, it would come out, people would sell it. If you knew there was one of these big conspiracies, you'd go to the media and sell your story. If you look at that article and at the footnotes, what's his evidence for this? And he says, well, we found out about the warrantless wiretaps that the Bush administration was doing. Well, yeah, we found out about them, but it was only 2 years after the 2004 election. They knew about it at the New York Times and held that until after the election, and would never have told us, except one of their reporters, James Rison, was publishing a book in 2005 that had this in there, that they had done these warrantless wiretaps. So I think that's a very good point, and you're absolutely correct. There's the assumption that the press would talk, and in reality, the press is the big gatekeeper of all this stuff. So why do we use the term conspiracy theory? I mean, if it's so stupid and un-American and nonsensical and befuddling, why do we use it? Well, it turns out that the term was popularized by the Central Intelligence Agency in response to the critics of the Warren Commission. In 1967, the Central Office of the CIA sent a memo to all its stations around the world telling them to contact their media assets and tell them if they come across people criticizing the Warren Commission report to call them conspiracy theorists, say there's no evidence of a conspiracy, say that if there had been a conspiracy, somebody would have talked, the newspapers would have uncovered it. It's all the things we hear today about conspiracy theory, the criticisms of it, were in this memo. In my book, I replicate the memo in the appendix. This was reported in the New York Times in 1976 when the memo was declassified, and mistakenly declassified. It was in the news one day, and that was it. They also said, they said you should tell people who are labeling people conspiracy theorists, they should say that the conspiracy theorist is under the sway of communist propagandists. So the idea was if you talked about Kennedy being assassinated by one of our people, that it was something the communists were pushing on us. And it was applied to the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Wallace. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated, the night he was assassinated, the police are radioing. They were chasing people who they thought might have been involved in it. One of them was this woman that wore the polka dot dress. This is kind of an arcane point. But what's interesting is the police say on the radio, don't chase this person. We don't want another conspiracy theory. So they're already using this term by 1968 and trying to, and being concerned about it. This is just a chart showing the number of stories in the New York Times with the term conspiracy theory in it. I don't know what more to say about it, but I did want to mention, does anybody here know about Google Ngram search? the letter N, dash Graham, G-R-A-M. They have a program where they've scanned in books, 5 million books, from the year 1500 to 2008. And you can do a word search on terms and see how often it maps it out for you, just like this. And you can put in conspiracy theory, and it'll show you. It's very interesting to work with. One of the things I'm trying to do is develop a forensic science for tracking these memes, because that's what the government's doing. And we realize that. We know that they, when they devise a war plan, they'll think up some term like, Operation Iraqi Liberation. Oh no, that was oil. Operation Iraqi Freedom. But we know they do that. But I don't think we do. We realize that they're doing it behind, secretly, and inserting these memes into our public discourse. So I'm using the Google Ngram. Yes, sir.
Yeah. What was the very first reference that you found to the use of the term?
The term conspiracy theory had come up in a book by Charles and Mary Beard in 1913. It was called The Conspiracy Theory of the 14th Amendment, and it was written about in academic. It wasn't popular. You can't find it in the newspapers, but you can find it in their scholarly work. And there was a letter to an editor around 1935 complaining about the conspiracy mentality. And there was a story in like 1963 that was before the Kennedy assassination that was about the conspiracy mindset. So you pick up a little thing, but what you don't see is it being used 25, 30 times. Yeah.
And then specifically in the New York Times was the first use
64.
50-52?
No, it's picking this up. It picks up an earlier year because the data, as far as I can tell, the Google data has some year mistakes in it, if you go back and track the original sources. The main problem we have that has influenced our thinking with the conspiracy theory label is it causes us to look at these events as isolated events. Like we have conspiracy theories of Kennedy, of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, but we don't have conspiracy theories of assassinations. We don't look at them together. If I say Kennedy assassination, I'm talking about President Kennedy. Nobody ever uses the term Kennedy assassinations, plural. But those were connected conspiracies, obviously. John Kennedy was running for president. His brother was running for president. When does his brother get killed? His brother gets killed on the night he wins the Democratic primary in California. Okay, so there's obvious connections, and yet we don't say Kennedy assassinations. We don't say 9/11 anthrax. The anthrax occurred immediately after 9/11. It shaped the way we saw it. 9/11 was scary, but it was just in New York. The anthrax could have hit anybody, anywhere. It was very frightening. And yet we separate those in our minds. The term conspiracy, if you have multiple conspiracies, that's called organized crime or serial crime. And we should use that term instead of conspiracy. But it causes us to look at events in isolation. Watergate burglary. 2000 and the 2004 elections, those were almost identical in terms of the sabotage that was done. Making it difficult for minorities to register, putting too few machines in the urban Democratic strongholds, so the lines were real long, and people would get discouraged and go away. There were computer anomalies. In Florida, the exit polls showed Gore winning by 3 percentage points, and when the voting returns came back, it was Bush at 500 votes more. Same in Ohio. The exit polls showed Kerry winning by 2 or 3 points, and then when they count the votes, well, that should tell you something. I call it incident-specific myopia. And I point out to people that this is the opposite of the way we view ordinary crimes. If a husband marries a man marries a wealthy woman and she falls in the shower and is killed, and he inherits a bunch of money, we're automatically suspicious because it's an improbable event and he benefited. If he then marries another wealthy woman and she falls and hurts or gets killed in a similar accident, we're convinced that this is a plot. I mean, our minds are automatically suspicious. What happened, what they've done, and this is the way these memes work, they're normal, rational processes. When you see things occur, you tend to look at a pattern and you suspect things. And what the conspiracy theory meme is doing is breaking down that rational process. You're not supposed to think about connected crimes. You're not supposed to suspect these people. And so you look at them one by one and you miss the connections between them. Opposite of the way ordinary people. I mentioned, this is a Cass Sunstein article, I may have mentioned it. He is advocating that people who are in conspiracy theory groups online, me and my friends, I guess is who he's talking about, that they should be cognitively disrupted. What I think he means is that they're planting trolls, they're sometimes called, people to get on these online conversations and introduce arguments and ideas that are disruptive and make it very difficult for people to coalesce and strategize constructively about that. I mean, it is breathtaking hypocrisy, what he's proposing. And this is a guy who was head of information, the Office of Information in the Obama administration until recently. What he's saying is we're going to conspire to stop people from saying the government conspires. It's unbelievable. I mean, these people are twisted, deeply twisted. Yeah, I call it linguistic thought control. I think we have to have a name for this stuff, subliminal indoctrination. Sounds kind of paranoid, but if they're double speak, yes. Yeah, I went back and read 1984, and he has an appendix in that book that talks about the language and how he thought that they were taking out the emotions out of language and using all these acronyms that shaped your thinking and left you unable to connect your own life to what was going on. I just have a list of 18, 20 SCADs. We've talked about most of these. I include McCarthyism, Oswald, Tonkin, 68 October Surprise in Ellsberg, the attempted assassination of George Wallace. Wallace was running as a third-party candidate. He had the potential to draw away votes from Nixon. Ross Perot, when he ran, he got 20% of the votes nationally, but he took those votes from Bush, and Bush lost to Clinton. So this was a real fear. Wallace said that Nixon was behind it. He went to the FBI and complained about it. He said, how could this guy be stalking me? Where did he get the weapon? He was staying in expensive hotels. I didn't know my schedule. You know, it just doesn't make sense. Somebody had to be helping him. Watergate we've discussed. The attempt on Reagan is a little less clear, but I'll show you some stuff that might surprise you.
Why do you suppose they'd go for Reagan?
Well, the Reagan got shot 3 months after he was in office. And the person who shot him, this guy Hinckley, Bush was asked about Hinckley. Did he know him? Had he ever heard of him? He said, no, I don't know anything about these people. I've never heard of them. I have no connection to them. Well, it turns out the Hinckley family have been donating money to his campaigns, lots of money, big money. And then it turned out that the brother, one of the Bush sons, Neil, was having dinner with Hinckley's brother the night after the assassination. And you see connections like that, and it's very troubling. It's very troubling. So I include this as a low probability, but I would still consider it. Wellstone I have in here. He was killed in a plane crash when the Senate was evenly divided and debating about going to war in Iraq. Okay? I tell my students, do not fly on airplanes with U.S. senators when the Senate is evenly divided. Okay? It's a big risk. There's practical implications to my theories and research. Iraq, 2004, the bogus terror alerts were when they would raise the thing from yellow to orange. Every time Bush's support would go down, there'd be a terror alert. And that's a manipulation. If you just look at the confirmation, most of these are well confirmed. Maybe not officially, but many officially. A few are not so well confirmed, but still are awfully suspicious, including 9/11. And then the low confirmation are the ones that we just haven't gotten confessions, we haven't gotten people talking, we haven't gotten forensic evidence, medical evidence, and that kind of thing. This was the article in the Houston Post on Reagan, on Bush's son dining with the suspect's brother. I tracked this down through our interlibrary loan. People who do these kinds of crimes, most of them are lawyers. They know the law. They know it very carefully, and they know what they can do with evidence and so on. They've sworn these secrecy oaths. Ellsberg said that the oath that they swear means that even if they're in Congress and they're asked something, they can't say that they know something, that it overrides their sworn oath to Congress. Compartmentalization, conflicts of interest, we know about that. And then, of course, if worse comes to worse, when we've finally got them pinned down, they pardon everybody who might testify against them. They tend to cluster around elections. So the 64 election, the 68 election, 72 election, the 80, 2000, 2004. So when you have a presidential election, be on the lookout for these things. If you look at what are the most common modus operandi, I'm trying to use this criminological lingo because I find it helpful. The most common is assassinations, and I'm counting these as 6, and Leahy and Daschle, the Senate leaders who received the anthrax letters, I don't include in this 6, so it would be 8 if you included that. So that's a very common one, and it's an old historic political crime. You got somebody that you're competing with, kill them. Manipulation of foreign events to stir up fear and warmongering is almost as common as assassination. And that's another one that is, the language speaks to us about false flag operations and provocations, agents provocateur, that kind of thing. Provocations, the election tampering, and then the burglary. The black bag job is something that they do, but it's more likely they do that to us as opposed to a very high leader. But the most common ones use the skills and tactics of the military and intelligence. It's a signature, in effect. If you look at the confirmation in terms, so these are the high confirmation, the medium, and the low. And if you look at what they are, the things that we don't learn about are assassinations. They're very hard. People don't confess to murder. It's really hard to get that out. They will confess to McNamara confessed that they knew the Gulf of Tonkin was bogus. He said this on a film. So they'll confess to things like that, but they won't confess to treason and assassination. It's hard to get that information out. And I think that that's the attitude we should have. When we see an assassination, we should realize that it's going to be very hard for us to uncover this. We should be very skeptical about what the government says, and we should be insisting on a thorough investigation. Most of the time, these are done for the benefit of military activities, either start a war, prolong a war, create fear of a war. And there are some that are just political opportunism. Nixon was a murderer, and Johnson was. This has come out recently that he had a hired killer that worked for him in Texas. And when you're running against people like that, you likely, think about it. Basically, everybody that ran against Nixon got killed. Okay? John Kennedy beat Nixon in 1960. He gets assassinated in 1963. Robert Kennedy is running against him in 1968 and would have won if he lived. He gets whacked. And George Wallace is running against him in 1972, and he gets killed or crippled. If you saw that in an ordinary crime, you'd be saying, well, this is obvious. We should be talking to Nixon. Let's find out where this guy was. What do his friends say? Let's talk to his underlings. Let's promise them if they'll confess that we'll give them a good deal. Any ordinary guy, that's what would happen to him. President of the United States, forget it.
It's not illegal if the president does it.
Yeah, that's what their attitude is. That's what Nixon said. If you look at the assassination targets, it's only presidents. It's not vice presidents. It's not U.S. Supreme Court and senators and presidents. It's not the Supreme Court. I don't want to put any thoughts in anybody's head. But the Supreme Court justices, they don't have protection. They go jogging down in Washington. They have enormous power. People say, well, people don't know who they were. Let me tell you, when I was growing up, there were signs all over the South that said, impeach Earl Warren. Literally. People knew who Earl Warren was in the South. No House member since Gabrielle, or until Gabrielle, and there's no evidence to suggest that that was any kind of SCAD. But, you know, there are a lot of House members. I was in Washington about 6 months ago, was walking around Congress, and Ron Paul came walking by. And I saw it, I said, boy, I just really, you inspire me. I think it's great, the things you do. But I thought, he said thanks and walked on, and I thought, hell, I could have killed him right there. I mean, I wouldn't have done it. I don't want you to get that. But, because I like him, at least. But, I mean, the point was, he had no protection. He was just out in the open, and there were no gun screens or anything. There was nothing to prevent people from being around him with weapons. So it's bizarre that it's the president that gets targeted. The one thing about the presidents, they only get shot when you've got a very different vice president who, like Johnson was a real hawk when Kennedy was a dove. George H.W. Bush was a CIA-connected guy when Reagan was more of an isolationist in some ways. And I think the Bushes figured this out, actually. When George H.W. Bush appointed Dan Quayle as his VP, sort of assassination insurance. and George W. Bush appointed Cheney. I mean, you know, are you really going to kill him and get Cheney for president? Nixon actually said when Ford got appointed vice president, he said, uh-oh, I am really worried now. I wasn't worried before when had Agnew, because they weren't going to impeach me and have Agnew president. But now Ford is vice president, I'm in trouble. So they think about this. Oh, they're increasing, and they tend to occur around particular administrations. The Bush people are really very suspect. I think we should be very, very cautious about them. There have been a lot of crimes committed while members of their family were in office. And Jeb Bush may run, so yes, sir.
You mentioned the King assassination earlier.
Yes.
Of course, William Pepper has done.
It's an excellent book, yes. Yes.
And he's now investigating Robert Kennedy.
Yes. And Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Jr. came out about 6 months ago and said that he thought it was a conspiracy, and that Douglas's book, The Unspeakable, was a good account of it. The Kennedys have never spoken about this. And, you know, people say, well, why? I mean, why would they not speak out? For one thing, they're afraid of getting killed, okay, which is a reasonable fear. But the other thing is there's the elites. This is like the worst taboo. If you speak ill of a fellow elite, it's just a terrible thing. So I think they think of protecting their class interest as more important.
The thing to remember is that this doesn't just happen in this country. One example, in Mexico in 1994, there was a reformist candidate named Colosio who was murdered by someone within the official party, and it's never been solved. So it happens in other places. But one interesting thing I wanted to question you on is when your articles are rejected by official magazines and publications, why not go to somewhere like Mother Jones, the Progressive, some of the other really good alternative media out there? It was Mother Jones that exposed the Romney comment before the last one.
Do you know what? I've tried to publish in the New York Times. I did get this article in the Guardian. But frankly, my perception is that the left will go all the way up to, but they won't step over the line where we talk about crime. I mean, and we can talk about scandal, we can talk about immoral behavior, but when we talk about crime, that these people are murderers, these people are traitors, these people are embezzlers, you know, we can't say that. That's just too much. It's too much because it implies an action in response. If our leaders are murderers, we can't just sit back. You know, if they're unscrupulous, well, that's okay. If you're, you know, having an affair with the intern, oh, well, that's okay. Yes, sir.
I would like to hear your interpretation of why Ronald Reagan chose George H.W. Bush as his vice president.
The story is that Rockefeller went to him and said, "You got to do it. This is our guy." Yeah. They said in the CIA, Bush had been in the CIA, and they said when the campaign posters were put up surreptitiously in the CIA, there'd be a campaign poster for Reagan Bush, but they would always tear it and take Reagan out. And it was just, but look, they named the building after Bush, the CIA headquarters building. They say he protected them during the Church Commission hearings and all that. I mean, if we saw the Soviet Union, the head of the KGB become the head of the Soviet Union, which is what we saw with Putin, basically comes the head of Russia, I mean, we'd automatically think, well, this guy's connected. This guy's going to be a gangster of sorts. But we haven't said that about our own system. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have much to say about SCADs since 2008?
Well, we've got, the Syria is a SCAD. If we go into that, Libya, in a way, is a SCAD. I mean, it was a violation of international law. It subverted the democratic process because Obama got a tortured Office of Legal Counsel memo saying it wasn't an act of war. So he knew what he was doing. He was subverting it. I'm still holding uncertain the Boston Marathon bombing. I was looking for a connection. There was a peculiar thing that did happen, and that was there were ricin letters that were mailed in Alabama or somewhere. And it occurred right with this. And so I got to thinking, well, you know, this is very similar to 9/11, where you have this bombing terrorist attack and then the biological attack. And I got to thinking, well, maybe it was a booster shot, you know, from the higher ups. They thought, you know, we needed a little jolt. They didn't want to do a full-blown nuclear attack or something like that, dirty nuclear bomb somewhere, really get us freaked. But they felt like they needed to, I know it sounds very paranoid, but that's what if you go back and read in SC 68 and you realize that the government doesn't trust you, the government thinks you are a liability in their effort to maintain your freedom, your viability. Once you realize that, you have to understand they see this as a responsibility to take care of us, and that may mean sacrificing us at times. Yes.
Behind all of this, these SCADs, appears to be a huge profit motive. And don't we see the banks?
Yes.
Who make their highest profit by far funding war and defense contractors?
Yes.
And these are the people at the apex of these crimes. And
Yes.
they make a huge amount of money
Yes.
by keeping war.
Yeah, it's a war machine, and it's a financial machine. I have a friend in Australia that writes about economic SCADs, or he calls them, economic SCADs. They're state crimes that are anti-democratic, but their motive is profit. And there's some specific instances he has in Australia where the government is literally creating projects to fund these nefarious organizations. And they know it's waste of money. So anyway, yes, there's an economic component. To some extent, I try to stay on the crimes and get the empirical evidence and then abstract away from that to consider what's the nature of the criminal. And what I'm seeing is all the crimes, or very many of them, are related to war and militarism. And certainly they benefit the armaments companies, and to some extent the banks as well. But part of what I'm trying to do is create a foundation of work and forensic methods. I think of it as SCAD detectives. We're like Sherlock Holmes for the 21st century. That we're trying to figure out, how do we investigate these bastards? How do we investigate these people? When I look at science, the way it progresses, it uses observation methods. So the telescope, that was a huge advance for us. We saw moons circling around other planets. The microscope leads us to germ theory eventually. The thermometer, temperature, we learned that everybody has the same temperature. They used to think everybody had a different temperature. And so what I've been thinking about is, well, we need observation methods for SCAD detection, for state crime detection. And for example, after every election, we should have an audit of the ballots against the exit polls. If we can't do that, we should at least have the statisticians look at, they've got techniques now where they can tell when the numbers are made up, and there are certain patterns to look for. But that should, and if the government won't do it for us, we're going to have to do it for ourselves. And that's pretty much what's been happening. After 2004, Steve Freeman, a statistician at the University of Pennsylvania, looked at all the exit polls and the election returns and compared them and found that 10 out of 11 battleground states had statistically improbable deviations of the returns from the exit polls, and they always favored Bush. And he said, and he calculated the probability of that given the difference between the exit poll and the returns and the sample sizes. And he said the odds of that happening by chance were like 1,000,000 to 1. But we need methods like that. His paper was published on the internet, and a lot of people followed it. It led to a lot of activity in Florida about elections. But, you know, we need to institutionalize this stuff. Yes, sir, hear you.
Well, we privatized the election counters. The contract went out.
It's unbelievable.
The software is private property.
Yes,
All that kind of
it's unbelievable. And why we would put our elections in the hands of people that even if they're angels, why we would do that it just makes no sense. When the Orange Revolution occurred in the Ukraine, one of their candidates, who eventually wins the presidency, was poisoned with something that made his face real bad. I don't know if you remember that. And they were interviewing his campaign manager right before the election, and they said, well, you know, do you have any worries about the election? He says, yeah, I'm worried about keeping my guy alive. And, you know, they said, well, really? He said, well, yeah, think about it. We're talking billions of dollars in government contracts and policy affecting, you know, all kinds of things. You think the stakes are not enormously high? People wouldn't do something like that? Well, think about the United States elections. Huge financial implications, huge ideological implications. And then we're going to set it up where we have voting machines with no paper trail that are vulnerable to hacking, and that you can actually plant programs in the machines that switch votes between candidates and then erase themselves at the end of the day. Yeah, I left out, I mean, I think I need to go back and look at Vince, what was the guy's name? He shot himself twice in the head. Vince Foster. Went to a park and shot himself twice in the head. That's interesting. But what I say in the book, actually, is that I think Republicans are more likely to commit these kinds of crimes than Democrats, and that it has to do with the class base of their party, that they are the upper crust, and the people who are wealthy think the laws don't apply to them, whereas the working people, the working people, you know, they just obey the laws. Yep.
I was very interested in the fact that assassination seems to be the most popular
Yes.
state crime against democracy. But it's ostensibly the CIA can now kill people by giving
By
them
drones,
cancer,
yes.
by giving them
Cancer, yeah.
or heart attacks. So
Yep.
our methods of forensic investigation are going to be a little bit more
difficult. Well, one thing that I've been looking at is the migration of CIA skills from overseas to the United States. What we see is we have a series of assassinations in the 1950s, and then we get a series in the U.S., the assassinations overseas, then they occur in the U.S. We learn to overthrow elections, and then we see election returns that are peculiar. So but these guys, I mean, we cannot underestimate their capabilities. I know that people would accuse me of being paranoid and freaked out, but these These are scientists. These are dedicated professionals who are dedicated to influencing us. And they have big budgets. And they're compartmentalized. And what the compartmentalization allows you to do is take control of it, and the people continue to do their compartmentalized work and don't realize that the operation has been steered to another thing. When John Kennedy was killed, Robert Kennedy's first reaction was that they had taken the Bay of Pigs people and diverted them to Kennedy, to his brother. Yes.
I'd like to bring out something too, which is I've noticed something with particularly people on the left that follow Noam Chomsky, whom I respect a great deal of the work of Noam Chomsky, but I think when it comes to conspiracy stuff, he's very vitriolic and calls people a cult. How dare you even suggest that? And there's a presentation that was presented particularly about 9/11, which falls into the work that Noam Chomsky and others have been doing, which is saying, hey, we're doing all these horrible things in the Middle East, and then all of a sudden, hey, look, okay, this is blowback, this is what we get. And it kind of fit into this narrative, which is, I thought it was blowback too for probably the first year after it happened. But I've noticed that there are some individuals on the left, particularly followers of Chomsky, who feel threatened by and feel that this is actually undermining, and they feel threatened by conspiracy.
Yes.
And feel that it undermines the real work that's going on and needs to happen. Of course, I have a very radically different perspective than that, which I think just kind of gets at the heart of what's going on. But you want to maybe address...
Yeah, no, Chomsky's a classic case. Chris Hedges is the same way. He's very good. He writes inspiring things, but when it comes down to crime, he just won't go there. And my suspicion is that the reason these people will not go there is they're afraid they'll be discredited. The conspiracy theory term and the norms associated with it are so powerful that if they touch it, they're going to be burned and tarred with that brush. The thing about it that makes it so powerful is that it's a legal thing. Once you get into talking about criminality, well, then we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about prosecution, we're talking about execution, we're talking about imprisonment. There's an apparatus that swings into motion if you designate something a crime. So I think it's great to talk intellectually about blowback and inequality and that kind of thing, but unless you get it down to these people are not just carrying out a class interest, they're committing crimes. Until we get to that, it's going to be hard for us to stop them. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to mention informationally that one of the early questioners, who I didn't turn around to see, mentioned Bernays.
Yes.
And there was only one copy of his book circulating here in Colorado, but his books are actually in print.
Yeah.
Propaganda,
Yes.
opinion, they're in print. You can buy them, and he is a master propagandist. As I remember, one of his famous phrases was about something to the effect, the necessary manipulation of the mass public mind.
Yes.
And so he's well worth reading.
Yeah, he was involved in the World War I effort, and a lot of guys came out of that. Harold Laswell and Lipton. Yeah, so there's a great book in sociology called The Science of Coercion by I forget the guy's name, but it goes through the history of psychological warfare and says that in sociology that's what it was. They called it something else, but it was really murder and assassination and all that, and they legitimated it, but that's what they were studying, how to manipulate populations. There's a famous book by Charles Beard, The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, where he says if you read the Constitution, it protects the class interests of the people who wrote it. And the other thing you might find interesting, Charles Beard developed what came to be called the conspiracy theory of the 14th Amendment. This is the amendment that gives the rights of citizens to corporations. And what Beard said was that the terminology persons was put into the 14th Amendment specifically to have it interpreted by the courts so that they would give these rights to corporations. It was a conspiracy. It involved the railroad lobbyists and the members of Congress who drafted it. When a case comes to the Supreme Court, say again? A case comes to the Supreme Court in like the mid-1890s, And it was about whether corporations got these rights or not. And a former congressman and a lobbyist for the railroad testified in Congress that, yes, we conspired, we put that language in there, that was our purpose. And the Supreme Court said, you know, you'd think they'd say, you scoundrels, get out of my court. They said, oh, that was the intent. Okay, that's fine, that's what we'll conclude. So what we're dealing with is with corporations, with Citizens United and stuff like that, goes back to this kind of criminality.
So what's your opinion of what is happening in Colorado, where communities are actually going through the law to bring back democracy?
I think it's great.
And there are ballot initiatives in 5 communities.
Yep.
But, of course, our governor is fighting that along with the corporations.
I'm hopeful that we're going to see something like the progressive movement of the early 1900s. That there's some research recently that said that in the early 1900s, before you had the regulatory apparatus established and a lot of the controls in place, people tried to fight these big interests, and they had great difficulty with it. They, you know, the unions were broken up by hired thugs, but they learned, and they developed a consciousness about what was required. And it was the professionalization of government. It was getting rid of elected public officials down through the ranks and the spoil system and all that. So I think part of what's happening with things like fracking and fighting that and working through the local institutions is that you're experimenting and learning what's working, but you're creating the foundations for a much larger movement across a range of issues. Because what we've got with the corporations and finance is just, you know, how can you have a democracy when you've got this kind of concentration of wealth?
The revolving door between corporations moving into FDA government and actually holding.
The capture of the regulatory agencies. Yep.
I would just like to speak to what Marcia's
Please.
about with fracking, because I think one of the things that's so important about your term, state crimes against democracy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that it's not only illegal actions.
Right.
It's inactions and it's extra-legal actions.
Right.
For example, when the oil and gas companies exempt fracking from
Right.
7 federal laws, that apparently is also a state crime against them.
I think we should take seriously the oaths of office. And that oath is not just that you're going to obey the law, but you're going to protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution. And that Constitution is designed to empower us as a people. The preamble says we have come together to create this government so that we preserve our security and our rights and our freedoms. And when people swear to it, they're swearing to a broad oath. I mentioned, I think tonight, that when Andrew Johnson was impeached, he was impeached for insulting the Congress, was one of the things. But I mean, if you go back and read the impeachments, it wasn't like smoking guns. It was like, this guy's a scoundrel. You know, this guy is a liar. And that's what we've got to get back to. We don't need smoking guns. If we see that people are not protecting our interest, they are committing crimes. They're there to protect our interest. And, you know, I jokingly say, but there's some seriousness, that we should erect a guillotine down in Wall Street, you know, like a statue, but a guillotine, and just to remind people, this is what happens when you don't respond to the public over time. Eventually, they're going to get you.
Last night you mentioned the use of the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination, and it was purchased, of course, by Life magazine.
Right.
But the publisher of Life at the time was C.L. Jackson, who in fact was the architect of a CIA operation in psychological warfare called Operation Mockingbird.
Yes.
It began in 1952.
Yep.
And which continued not only through the period of the Kennedy's assassination, but at least up until 1975.
Yes, this is pervasive. There was a National Security Council memo called NSC 68. You can find it on the internet. It was produced in 1950. And what it said is the American people don't have the stomach, basically, to stand up toe-to-toe against the Soviet Union in a nuclear standoff, and it was going to take some effort on the part of the leadership to make us realize the importance of doing this. But it was basically a plan to manipulate the mass public, and I think, certainly it included Mockingbird, the infiltration of the civil rights, anti-war, and women's movement. I'm pretty paranoid at this point. When I see, I wrote an article for The Guardian about 3 weeks ago when they closed the embassies down because of they said there was chatter in the electronic communication and there were going to be these attacks. And I wrote this editorial and said, hey, we've seen this before. They do these terror alerts whenever they're in trouble and everybody's criticizing the electronic surveillance, and suddenly the electronic surveillance is saving us from these attacks. It's ridiculous. But it's a pervasive thing. There's a French psychoanalyst named Lacan, who talks about the authoritative, the regime of order, of conceptual order, what's our framework. And I think that's what happens is you plant a few key concepts and events, Gulf of Tonkin attack, 9/11, and everything else gets framed around that, everything downstream. So you can have a democratic process downstream, and you think you're influencing Congress, but they've already set the agenda for you with these state crimes. Okay, let me get back to it, because I get this a lot. People ask me when I go over this, well, what can we do? Well, if they're running the country like this and staging and orchestrating these events that shape our society and our politics, what can we do? My answer, one simple answer, is enforce the law. Enforce the law. We have pretty good laws on the books about conspiracy and fraud. When the Bush administration said that they didn't want to see the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud, and that they were sure that yellow cake had been bought at Niger and all that. Well, they had other information that they didn't tell us. They had other information. The Germans had said they didn't trust the intelligence. The people in Niger said, no, this hadn't happened. But they didn't tell us that. They didn't come to us and say, well, we have very confusing intelligence, but we're thinking about launching a war. They said, we have very clear intelligence. That was an act of fraud. And experienced prosecutors have said that George Bush should be prosecuted for murder, that he got these soldiers killed under false pretenses. It's a simple thing of controlling the crime scene after an assassination. We had heard things in 2001, 2002, 2003 about surveillance, but nobody paid much attention to it until we had documents. This is what Ellsberg says in Secrets. He says, you can tell people about it, you can be an insider and say, I heard this, but people will blow you off. But if you have the documents. Another thing I think that we need to do is be careful with our language. And that's why I'm looking at conspiracy theory and saying, that is a bad term. That is a bad term. I think that 9/11 is not a good term. I don't mean to say, I'm not sure what we would call it, but by defining it as a date, it elevates the importance of the event, and we need to ask ourselves, where did that term come from? We've never called these events by dates. We didn't call Pearl Harbor 12/7. We didn't call Kennedy 11/22. Why did we call this? Anyway, here I'm going on.
What do you think of the Boston Marathon bomb?
There are a lot of suspicions about it, a lot of questions, and a lot of peculiar coincidences. I'm not compelled by the idea that it was a conspiracy, but I wouldn't rule it out. But here's what I asked myself when I saw it. Were there any other crimes committed around it during the same time? Because when you go back and look at state crimes against democracy, the way I'm defining it, what you see is they occur in clusters. So you have Watergate, You have Ellsberg being stalked. You have the 1968 October surprise. When you see these, what happens is, I think, when these criminal elements get into government and start acting, they don't stop with one crime. When they killed Kennedy, they didn't stop with Kennedy. They killed Oswald. Yes, sir, in the back. No.
You made a great point. You said what we need to do is enforce the law. It's a great point. So how do you propose to do that?
Well, one thing I'm trying to do is devise forensic techniques that allow us to come forward with something beyond speculation. I have written about it, about let's get laws passed that mandate. One thing I think we should have is if there's an assassination, we should mandate the crime scene is controlled, all the witnesses are interviewed, and those are made public. Right now, that's the problem. That's the problem. No.
Have you ever heard of the grand jury?
Yeah, I have read about that. There's a guy in Florida that's talking about it. That's right. And that's an important point, too, is to try to find venues that are legal processes. So it's not us just arm waving, that we can actually get some action, some legal action. A woman who ran for Attorney General didn't win in, it was a northeastern state. Anybody know what I'm talking about? She ran with the idea of prosecuting Bush for murder. And she got Bugliosi, the lawyer who prosecuted the Manson for his murder, has written a lot, and she had him as an advisor. But that was their argument, is we need to get this into judicial processes.
Unless the citizens all sitting here start taking action to figure out what your legal rights are for grand juries, you can wave your arms till hell freezes over. The people running the show are not going to do anything.
Yep.
We're the ones in charge.
I'm going to go here and here, and then I'm going to try to wrap this up.
Have you heard about a movement to have only 3% of Americans pull all their money out of the bank? Should
Oh,
be
God.
military strike in Syria? And if you have had, do you think that would be effective?
Well, it would certainly cause a lot of economic damage, and I don't know. I look at Occupy Wall Street as a good example these days of a mass movement. It didn't have a lot of effect on the doing a business in the United States, but it changed the discourse. People now talk about 1%ers. And when Romney was running for president, there was that tape where he came out with the 47% who get all this stuff. You know, it really affected the discourse. So my strategy is to affect the discourse. That I think that's something we can do. Buy my book. Write reviews on Amazon. Tell people that use the term state crimes, elite political criminality. Don't let people use the term conspiracy theory. Say, wait a minute, that's a flawed term. We know that came from the CIA. We've got no business using this. As it stands, it's the other way around. If you're on TV and you say something like, that's a conspiracy theory, everybody goes, yeah, we shouldn't talk about that. So I think that, I don't mean to say that that's, it's not getting us into grand juries, it's not getting us into court. When I was in Toronto in 2011 for their 10-year hearings, there was a judge there from Italy who was on the Supreme Court of Italy. And that's what he said, you've got to get this into a court of law. He recommended that we go to the United Nations has an international criminal court. They can do investigations, and we could investigate the United States, even if the United States said they didn't want to be investigated. And we can't necessarily try anybody, but we can at least investigate and embarrass the heck out of the leadership and change people's thinking about it. So I agree. I think we need to be looking at judicial processes, but also the language, also speaking up. It's a quandary. American democracy is in real trouble if it even exists anymore. And
When you say democracy, are you referring to Republican democracy or democracy?
I'm referring to the spirit of popular control of government, and not necessarily representative government, although that's the form that we have. I think we have a constitution that is revered and a set of founders that are revered. And let me tell you, these people were conspiracy theorists. These people were vigilant. They were concerned about tyranny. They thought that anybody who had power would abuse it. That's why they created the system of checks and balances, to pit against each other the powers. They had these people swear an oath. Their top priority is not to protect the people. It is to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution of the United States. They swear an oath to that. When they violate that oath, that's an impeachable offense, even if it's in the spirit. Go back and look at how we've impeached presidents. When we impeached Andrew Johnson, he was impeached for things like insulting the Congress. Today, it's like you've got to find this smoking gun. You know, what did Nixon know and when did he know it? Wait a minute, you don't have to know that. Nixon hired a bunch of criminals. He should be impeached just for that. So I think that the founders are important, and we need to resuscitate that tradition. It gives us a foundation for uniting the right and the left in this country, the Tea Parties and the left, on the rule of law and the Constitution. For one thing, we couldn't go into Syria if we followed the Constitution. Peter, and then I'm going to come to you in the back.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, there's an amazing amount of apathy in this country, which is really sad. But I was wondering, like people like you speak out, what do you think the possibility of the Patriot Act has, in getting people to feel safe and really challenging?
I think there's a counterculture forming now because of the mass surveillance that has now been publicized. That it's impossible for the American people not to see themselves as distinct and separate from the government. And the government is not their government anymore. The government is the government. And they are, in a ways, the adversary, the enemy, and are being snooped on. And just that state of mind is going to cause what happened in the 60s, the counterculture, where people begin to talk about us and what we think and what we believe and feel, as opposed to what these people in Washington think. The 1% language does that a little bit. But I think, look, it's not for nothing that somebody like me is writing about state crime. People are waking up. People are beginning to see. They're apathetic, but when it comes to their liberties and their personal freedoms, they take it a little bit more seriously. So I personally think that we're going to see a real revolution of consciousness in this country in the next, maybe. The other thing I would say about looking back at the 60s is that took 10 years. Okay, you had the counterculture movement began in the early 60s on the campuses. You had the anti-war movement really flowing out of the civil rights movement and the women's movement. That all takes about 10 years. And you don't get, the church commission for 15 years. It's a long process. Today we have the internet. Today we have email. Today we have dialogues that occur very quickly on this information. You can go home tonight and look up that dispatch I was telling you about. You have the document. You can say to people, you want to see where conspiracy theory came from? That word? Here, take a look at this. That is light years ahead of where we were in the 60s. So I think that there is a realization coming.
You're talking about moving past left and right and talking about resurrecting constitutional governance and law and order, essentially, in our country. But one thing you mentioned when you were talking about the Boston Marathon, that you look for unusual patterns of what appears to be like illegal activity. And I would add to that also pushing the envelope. For example, in Boston, that was an instance where they instituted martial law.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. So they did these demonstrations.
Yep.
And accompanied with a lot of press that's very self-congratulatory how happy everyone was that they did that. And that sort of thing, I think.
Well, and I think our attitude should be that should be investigated. All that stuff should be investigated. The Athenians had a process when you got out of office. They went through all of your records to see if you had committed any crimes. And that's what we should do. When you leave office, it should be a thorough inspection of the books and taking depositions from people and so on. These guys would get a lot straighter after that.
And because of the popularity of that movie called Argo, and because of the recent publication in the Christian Science Monitor of what Bonnie Sauter said really happened during the hostage.
Yes.
I'd appreciate it if you could go into that more.
Well, the 1980 October surprise. George Bush was the vice president nominee with Reagan, and he and Bill Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense under Bush, and Bill Casey, this should tell you, William Casey was the campaign manager for the Reagan-Bush campaign, and after they got elected, they made him head of the CIA. Now, is that, you go, campaign manager, CIA, whoa. But same with Bush. I mean, he had been head of the Republican National Party in 1972 when Watergate happened. They make him head of the CIA. Ford puts him in there. So, but in 1980, Gates, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Casey met with the Iranians and got them to keep the hostages through the election so that Carter would look weak, and it ultimately costed Carter the election. There was an obvious tell in that SCAD too, and that was they released the hostages on inaugural day. I mean, they do this. This is an amazing thing to me. It's obvious. You know, what's the difficulty is pinning these people down and proving it, but you can see it on the surface. They did an investigation of that in Congress, and Casey and Bush came up with alibis, and of course said it was ludicrous to think they had done it and all that. And then later their alibis came into question. There were real doubts about, they appear to have slipped off from meetings that they were supposed to be in. But when Iran-Contra broke, see what they had told the Iranians in 1980 was that if they would hold the hostages, the Reagan-Bush administration would sell arms to Iran, they were fighting a war with Iraq, and so we had propped up the Shah in Iran, and so all their military stuff was American, and they didn't have like tires for their airplanes and things like that. And so Reagan and them said, "You keep the hostages, and then we'll sell you arms." Well, they start selling arms in April. This later comes in April, right after the inauguration. Later, this perambulates into the Iran-Contra scandal, where they're selling arms to Iran, taking the profits and sending them to rebels who are trying to overtake a democratically elected socialist government in Nicaragua. When they investigated Iran-Contra, the Congress stipulated that they would not go back and look at the 1980 issue. So they did all this investigation of Iran-Contra, but, well, we're not going to go back. But these guys, they all protect each other. They pretty much look after themselves. Nixon was pardoned. Understand this, Nixon was pardoned not just for the crimes he committed, but for all crimes he committed or might have committed while president. Yeah, might have committed. Didn't even get a list. We don't even know what they were. You know? So when I say enforce the law, I mean, for one thing, we should have a law that says you can't pardon people who you order to commit a crime. I mean, geez. I mean, at the very least. Yes.
I was going to ask, how do you enforce the law when the people who are in the power and doing these conspiracies and whatever are the ones that are writing the law?
Yeah, no, it's a very big problem. But one thing that I've argued in my writings and in class is that the people near the bottom of the pyramid, they do the right thing. That if we have professional programs and encourage people to take an oath and remember when the hijackers were coming into the United States, there was a guy that stopped one of the hijackers and sent him back. When John Kennedy was killed, the Secret Service took his body back to Washington. There was supposed to be an autopsy in Dallas. And the coroner in Dallas tried to stop them. You know, stood in front of the coffin and said, "No, I'm not going to," and they moved him aside by force. But at the front line, we've got strong people. I mean, just regular old Americans, you know, they'll speak up. I think having juries instead of these Warren commissions, you know, I mean, you put all of these muckety-mucks on a commission and they're all going to take care of each other because they're thinking about, you know, I don't want to piss this guy off. You know, what am I going to get business from him? Are they going to appoint me to something later? Just give me an American jury and let them judge this stuff. So, but part of it is we have to restore our skepticism about our leaders. I mean, the founders thought they were dangerous people.